the timing, I think, of the announcement of their engagement is awesome because it coincides perfectly with like the NFL season starting too.
Well, it was a big story in our household.
Yeah. Yeah,
It,
big,
it
big
was
time T Swift
it was a
fan.
big deal. My wife is a big time Taylor Swift fan, but the engagement story, I actually broke it to her. I saw it on my phone through the NFL ticker. I got an NFL alert that Taylor Swift and Travis Kelsey are married, and then
Yeah.
I ran over to her office, next to me, and I was like, "Hey, guess what?" And she was like, "What?" And I was like, showed her the picture, and then
Oh,
she
man,
she
did
was
she
kind of
freak
annoyed that
out?
I found out first before her. Hey, but I'll give it that. Whatever some people hate on her, some people love her. But I went to her concert with Mariam, last year, and it's a
Yeah.
spectacle, man. It's something.
She's an
It's impressive.
awesome performer.
Yeah, it's impressive, and there's quite a bit of concerts I went to last year. The other concert that I really loved is Ed Sheeran. He came to Houston,
Oh, yeah?
and we went to his concert just a few months or earlier this year, and it was amazing. We also went to Justin Timberlake's concert a few months ago. But Ed Sheeran's concert was memorable. It was amazing, and my son is obsessed with that Sapphire song.
Yeah, he
I
is.
keep telling him, "Hey, can you play the Indian Sapphire, please?" Because there's the Indian version too, apparently now, and he loves that song.
Dude, that's funny when kids get to the age where they're like start requesting the music. Like Rayan has two go-to songs whenever we're riding in the car. At least he does with me. He has actually different songs with Samya because her music choice is a little different. He really likes this one song by Masked Wolf called Speed Racer. It's got a sick beat. Uh,
Oh,
He'll straight up say like, "Abba, play Speed Racer." It may not be the most child appropriate song. And then he likes this one Desi song, which is it's just a hilarious song. It's called Brown Monday. Great song, dude. I love
yeah.
hearing him say, "Abba, play Brown Monday." It's so
John
funny,
listens to
dude.
this song called Desi Boys.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've heard it.
Yeah, but he has this thing. He's like, play this song, play Sapphire first, then play Desi Boys, then play this song, and we go through this whole thing. And then he's like, I don't like short rides because short rides we can't listen to music.
He's got a vibe, bro.
Yeah, but Cat Lab, I mean, Cat Lab, some of the cases are so short that some of the music that we play in there, I don't care much for the music, but your cases are much longer. You
They
probably
can
care
be,
more.
we have what we call like one song cases, sometimes quick cases like a trigger finger or a carpal tunnel release. But yeah, like especially if you're doing a shoulder replacement or something, longer cases, you can get a pretty good playlist going. My go-to in the OR usually is either like tropical house, EDM, anything upbeat. Usually that jives with everybody. Um, those are probably my two
Yeah,
go-tos.
you can really just get into the zone, with
But
the
yeah, and honestly, it's so easy too because you just go to YouTube and type in like EDM long mix or tropical house long mix, and you have like a 2 hour thing playing constantly on YouTube, so you don't have to mess with it. No one has to change it, and it's not on someone's phone because then when they get a text or a phone call, it shuts off. Like totally kills the mood.
Yeah, no, no. It has to be a radio that's inside the cat lab or the
Yeah,
OR.
yeah.
They just play a lot of times. They just play the radio. But I love my music is more like singer songwriter. I mean, I pay a lot of attention to lyrics as well, and just having a good singer songwriter that writes his own songs and produces, or his or her, sorry. Those are my favorite. Some of these artists, like I mentioned, Ed Sheeran earlier,
Yeah,
Taylor Swift. Back in the day, back in college, John Mayer used to be. I don't know if you remember that guy.
I do. I do.
But and I think in medicine you have to kind of everyone has their own sense of music, and in cath lab, I just let the nurses play whatever they want to hear because my cases last probably 15 to 20 minutes max.
Yeah, I hear you. And the nurse is staying there all day.
Yeah, but talking about medicine and cath lab, I mean, I was just kind of reflecting on our discussion about the GLP-1s we had a few weeks back, and it's crazy. I was just reflecting on the Gila monster story about how there's this venomous lizard or monster or animal that has this
Right.
GLP molecule in its saliva, and somehow they extracted that and made it into a medication. I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize what goes on behind drug development, from discovery to it being available to mass populations. I mean, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean the discovery and innovation can come from sometimes the most random places, like the saliva of that lizard. You know, just like how penicillin came about or insulin. I mean, honestly, the stories, it's like history of medicine is tied to these stories of often these chance encounters. I mean, like we kind of talked a little bit in a past episode about insulin related to the GLP-1s, but I think the story of how insulin was discovered is really fascinating. I mean, it was one of the surgeons in Toronto, Frederick Banting, and a medical student, Charles Best, who actually discovered it and eventually ended up sharing the Nobel Prize for it. But like even years before that, they knew there was something in dogs. There was a lot of study in dogs with the pancreas, that there was something, they didn't know what it was. They called it some substance of the pancreas that led to, when it was removed, that led to diabetes. And then the dogs died because they found that out by just removing the pancreas from dogs and watching what happened. And eventually they withered away and died. And they started isolating more and more stuff, and they got this extract, this like murky brown stuff that was coming out of the pancreas, which was obviously an unrefined version of insulin, in addition to other pancreatic stuff. And they would inject it back into the dogs, and they were able to keep the dogs alive for longer and longer until they eventually passed away. And that is what eventually became insulin. And
I
so,
mean,
what,
before
what I,
before 1921, that discovery, people who had type 1 diabetes, it was a death sentence, right? I mean, they
yeah,
would just you were born with type 1, you developed type 1 diabetes in your teens or 20s, and all you could do was just starve, otherwise you would die soon.
yeah, it was game over. I mean, like literally, that was the medical practice. Put someone on like a sub 500 calorie a day restriction. I mean, you're basically starving to death. It was the only way. That's all they had. And so when they finally isolated this, I mean, I think it's also crazy the perseverance to discover some things like this, like all of this research and study from dogs to translate it into humans. And the first patient they ever injected what they thought was the cure was insulin into this kid. He was a 14-year-old kid in Toronto. They injected him and he almost died from an allergic reaction to the medication. And obviously he didn't die, and they refined it again. They purified it, something in there, and they injected him again. And remarkably, I mean, and so rapid, he improved. His blood glucose, everything improved. And he lived years after that, and eventually died of pneumonia, not from his diabetes. And that was revolutionary. I mean, it changed the game. Like so many kids, they would have wards of just kid after kid after kid in these diabetic comas, and it saved their lives. I mean, it totally changed the lives of those children and the families, and the rest is history. I mean, it gets commercialized and becomes one of the
I
most
mean,
game-changing medications in the world.
imagine if they had stopped after the allergic reaction, or if
Yeah,
imagine they were like, "Oh man, this doesn't work. This guy died. I mean, let's go somewhere else
yeah.
and look for something else." We would have never discovered insulin.
But
But
that's
like,
like the belief in your science, when you've really put your thought, your heart and soul in real research. I mean, they did so many lead up experiments, the rigorous, real scientific process. And you don't get stalled and crippled by fear, by one mistake, one error, one miscalculation. I mean, you have this body of evidence you've built up. Logically it should work. You just push through. I mean, it's the perseverance in science is remarkable sometimes to make these
yeah,
discoveries happen.
yeah. I mean, science is truly a beautiful thing, and there's been unfortunately a lot of distrust of science. I mean, there's a lot of people that love doing their own research. And for a lot of people, doing their own research means going on Google or ChatGPT and just looking something up, right? But what research truly is the perseverance, having a hypothesis, doing experiments, failing multiple times, and at some point successfully conducting an experiment that has a positive result. And that positive result sometimes leads to a game-changing discovery. I mean, there's countless drugs, right? There's things like insulin, there's penicillin. I mean, cardiology, there's statins, or medications like Entresto that have completely revolutionized the treatment of heart failure or lipid management. These the science is not efficient. Science is not a business. You don't do science to make money. Yeah, some people can make a lot of money from the right discovery, but unfortunately, in our society now, there's been this anti-science, or um,
Like a distrust of,
distrust of science, which
yeah.
is, sometimes I don't blame people. I mean, there was a lot of anxiety after COVID, a lot of misinformation from all sides and from everywhere. People were told certain things that turned out to be false later on, and they lost a lot of trust. But in the end, we have to realize as physicians that science and the scientific process is truly vetted out. It's very important to go through the scientific process, to have a hypothesis, to have a null hypothesis, conducting experiments, finding out and see if your hypothesis is met. That kind of rigorous perseverance towards a goal leads to the discoveries we have. And unfortunately, now we have this cutting of funding towards science that's not efficient. A lot of labs are losing money. A lot of big institution, NIH, is getting their funding cut because somehow our government thinks that their research and the work they're doing is not efficient, which science is not supposed to be efficient. Which
Yeah, it's being looked at in the totally wrong way, unfortunately. I mean, I'm in academics, and like some of my partners, like in my group, they've had their funding cut, they've had their grants rescinded. It's led to like institution-wide changes and funding cuts, which affects everything. And it's across the board in academia, and that's the training grounds for the next generation of doctors for the country. And when the funding is cut, education suffers.
Yeah. And just imagine that one lab that gets shut down that eventually had the cure for Alzheimer's. I mean,
Yeah,
it just takes one person, one or two people that have a small lab, they're conducting experiments, and they can discover something groundbreaking. And people do not realize that. They think that, just, there's a lot of money being wasted at these academic institutions, and, they would rather have their money go to wars or, violence or, taking
yeah.
over other countries, which
No,
is,
no kidding. I mean, and that's the thing. Like real science, like you were saying earlier, Humayun, it has to be inefficient because it has to be repeated and validated again and again, and trial and error, and it has to be consistent. And you have to not just do it one time and be like, oh, voila, there we go, we did it. You got to do it again and again and again, and make sure that you can reliably execute it again and again, and it stays true. That's never going to be an efficient method to create something, and it doesn't need to be.
yeah. And there's this huge idea of big pharma is all out to get us and fool us into giving up their money and taking all these drugs and making all their focus is on profits. I mean, pharmaceutical companies are corporations. In the end, their goal is to maximize their bottom line. But I mean, a lot of the funding comes through them, and a lot of groundbreaking medications receive the funding from a lot of these big pharmaceuticals that end up becoming the life-saving treatments that we have. I mean, me and you both use these medications on a daily basis, or procedures or devices that we use on a daily basis that went through clinical trials. There's so many different phases of clinical trials, so many ways that these medications get approved, sometimes from discovery to it being available in the market for people can take up to 10 to 15 years,
Yeah,
right?
it takes a long time, a lot of R&D costs to recoup too. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of colloquial stuff. Oh, this is phase one. This is phase two. What do those really mean? What are the phases of a clinical trial? Like, how does a
Yeah.
drug pass through these phases, get so-called FDA approved before it can go from an idea in some scientist's mind in a lab into a pill in a patient's mouth?
Yeah. I mean, there's technically like, let's say five stages to drug development, right? There's a preclinical stage. Preclinical stage is before it ever reaches human beings. Most of these preclinical studies are done in labs with animals, with mice, through techniques not like how we discovered insulin, which is squeezing the pancreas and insulin out of it, but more specific, more sophisticated techniques of extracting
It's not
different
like a lemon, you just squeeze the juice.
yeah, a little bit more sophisticated techniques to extract the medications or test maybe in rats or animals or mice how these medications are working. It looks for things like toxicity or safety or the biological activity. They're able to measure the pharmacokinetics of the medication. And if it shows some kind of promise in animal studies, it moves on to phase one clinical trials, which is where humans come into play, where these are very small groups. These phase one studies are very small, sometimes few hundred people, right? Um, Usually the focus is on safety and figuring out the dosage, making sure it's safe, making sure the dosage is right. A lot of times these phase one trials are inpatient trials. I mean, they're not. I mean, there's phase one centers where patients get admitted, they get the medications, they're monitored for a few days live, and there's a lot of close monitoring, a lot of blood sampling going on. So this is a very involved process. Comprised of a very small amount of volunteers. And then first, once we determine if it's safe for consumptions for human beings, and making sure that it's safe for the dosage that they're using, then we move on to phase two clinical trials. And the phase two clinical trials are pretty much determining, where the if it's effective, if it's truly effective based compared to placebo, and are there any side effects, and what exact dosages are effective. So is it the 10 milligrams versus the 20 milligrams versus the 50 milligrams? So when we do phase two clinical trials, there's many legs and arms, and phase two clinical trials are not as easy to do. I have done some, but they're very complicated. Patients get randomized into multiple arms. They can get randomized into 6 or 7 different arms, and each arm has its own dosage, its own length, and own processes. So it can be very complicated trial to do for a lot of people. But that's where we kind of refine the dosages. We see if the drug is inherently safe. There's no other side effects. And once that all that safety and the dosage is established, that's where the large scale trials come in. And these are the phase three clinical trials. And that's what mainly a lot of the phase three clinical trials is where I participate in. I've done some phase two, but phase three is mostly bread and butter. And phase three is pretty much confirming the efficacy versus placebo or some other competitor. They're large groups. There's thousands of people in there. They're multi-center global trials. You look at robust evidence of effectiveness. You see if there's years, and you do these trials over 2, 3, 4 years, and after these trials, all the data that's collected based on what the endpoint are, then it gets submitted to the FDA. Now, one drug, one compound, from its discovery to now, it can go through trials for multiple indications, right? So it can be for cardiovascular outcomes. It can be for a specific end goal. For example, like how much does it lower the LDL? Or the question could be, does it cause a decrease in cardiac events or decrease
So
in.
the same drug basically can concurrently be running in different trials
Yeah.
for different purposes of use.
Yeah, it's a whole program, right? So that one drug is going through multiple trials. It could be the same drug could be being tested for kidney disease and liver disease, and for obesity and for cardiovascular disease. There's multiple trials and multiple different types of physicians are involved, right? And then once they go through the phase three trials, where we know the dosage, where we know its efficacy against placebo or another competitor, we know the kind of effects it causes. At this time, we already know it's very safe. Then it gets FDA approved. It goes through FDA for the review, based on all the data that's collected. And then once it gets FDA approved, then the phase four trials come in, which are post-marketing trials usually. They're post-marketing surveillance when the drug is already on the market. A lot of data is being collected on what kind of side effects it's causing, what kind of effects it's causing. Some of the long-term effects come into play, like for example, the weight loss from a lot of the GLP-1s kind of start showing face in that phase where it's in large populations. You start seeing a lot of people are losing weight over long term, and maybe they're having an improvement in their heart failure or cardiovascular outcomes. And again, I'm talking a lot from the cardiology perspective because that's what I do, but it can mean any indication, right? All these.
Yeah, yeah, but no, but it's good to have like a basic understanding, like essentially phase one, you're looking at safety profile. Phase two, next level up, you're looking at efficacy and dosing in a little more detail. Phase three, much bigger trial, much broader trial, really refining that safe dosage and now comparing it head to head for your specific indication. Does it actually make a difference compared to placebo or some existing gold standard? And then FDA gets approved, goes to market, and now you do post-market once real patients are being prescribed this drug by real doctors across the country, and now you monitor it longer term. Hence, that's phase four. But it's good to hash that out. One interesting thing is the diversity of the patients that these drugs are tested on during, especially these earlier phases, even up to phase three. The initial cohort of patients that you use as your sample for these newer medications, if those patients are not representative of the population, it's hard to really know if the drug is going to have a similar efficacy and similar side effect and safety profile. Or is it just because you happen to sample just young males in the South? You know what I mean? That was an issue with a lot of trials, especially back in the day. I mean, even like the Framingham Heart Study, like one of the most famous series of studies that was done. One of the biggest critiques of that is it was largely young white males from northeastern United States that were followed, and obviously that study went on for generations and generations. But the initial results of that were very much not generalizable to females, non-whites, people with different age groups, people that potentially lived elsewhere, had different diets, all that kind of stuff. So that's something that I think is interesting, and I think it's changed a lot. Would you agree, Humayun, in
Yeah,
modern day trials?
I mean, yeah, there's, I do a lot of work with a lot of different pharmaceuticals. I'm currently working with all the big pharmaceutical companies doing clinical trials. As well. And there's a big push for diversity, looking for diverse patients. And now a lot of these companies are doing trials in different countries, right? And it's not just doing trials in the continental United States, but also having trials in China and India, and in the Middle East, in Europe, and combining all that data. So, but that's where the trial design is very important. Before even the medication gets started, the project gets started, and a lot of very smart physicians that some that are practicing, some that have left and are solely working on drug development, they all work together on creating the design of the trial, what kind of patients we'll be recruiting, and you're constantly reviewing the kind of patients you'll be recruiting through as the trial is going on, right? I mean, they start getting the data and they say, okay, we've already 60% of the patients so far that are enrolled in a clinical trial are women. So let's try focusing more now on males. 60% of the patients are now Caucasian. So let's try getting more African American patients and Asian patients. So there's a big push right now for having diverse set of populations, and a lot of sites are being chosen based on the diversity of the population, and a lot of times the physician that's conducting the trials, their ethnicity kind of leads to the ethnicity of the patients that will be enrolling in the trial as well. So that a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, or the CROs per se, that are conducting the trials or choosing sites, have a lot of those ideas in mind. Are we going to go in the valley in South Texas and have a couple of sites there, and have one in inner city Houston, maybe have one in San Francisco, and have one in Alabama? So depending on what kind of population mix they're looking at, the geography plays a huge role.
But I think that's awesome, though. That's becoming much, much more accepted as what should be the standard practice in these trials, because you have to have a diverse sample, a diverse study population. Otherwise, you have no idea how it's going to behave when it actually gets exposed to a diverse, real patient population out in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that, right? I mean, there's certain medications, there's certain antihypertensive, like, I treat people with high blood pressure all the time, and some medications work really well for some people, right? And then that same medication for another person, it does not work as well, and then you have to try a different medication, right? No two people are the same, and you need to have a diverse set of population in a clinical trial to have the right amount of data to journalize for the country that we're living in, right? Maybe in Sweden or in Norway, in Scandinavian countries, it's a more homogeneous mix of population, and you can journalize based on smaller data over there. But in the U.S., we're a very diverse country, and we need medications and that will be generalizable to the rest of the population as well. So I think having diversity is very important. And that's where the trial recruitment and the sites come into play, right? So it's a very interesting established setup that there's a pharmaceutical company, right? A lot of times, either the pharmaceutical company develops the compound, or they buy a smaller company or a smaller entity that had developed the compound. They buy it in that preclinical or phase one stage. And the more of a trend that's becoming now is that there's smaller companies that get funding, they develop something, and in the phase one stage, it shows promise, and a bigger pharmaceutical then comes in and buys it, and then starts moving it into the larger scale trials, because those phase two, phase three clinical trials need a lot of funding, a lot of money, right? And without the FDA, the complicated FDA regulatory process we have, they have to go through that kind of funding, those large scale trials. So there's the pharmaceutical that creates the compound, is responsible for getting that compound to the market, and then there's the middleman, which is the CROs, the clinical research organizations. These are organizations like IQVIA or PPD, and what their responsibility is to conduct that trial. Right, these are the middlemen between pharmaceutical and the actual patient and the clinical sites. They a lot of times are involved in creating the procedures of the trial, choosing the vendors. You need the central lab where all the blood will be sent and the data will be collected. You need monitors to come in and make sure that the data being collected at each site is accurate and applicable. No site is doing like shady activities and collecting false data. So there's a lot of close monitoring. So these CROs are middlemen, and then below that are physicians and clinical sites. And historically, a lot of times these CROs would come to academic institutions like University of Texas, Baylor, or MD Anderson, and they would give them the trials, and they would conduct the trials over there. They would coordinate with the pharmaceuticals and collect the data. But now things are moving more towards the private side, as private practice physicians or bigger practices are also conducting trials in the community, because not everyone wants to go to the academic centers. And when we talk about diversity in clinical trials, you get diverse populations by being in smaller community settings, in the suburbs, in the rural towns, in South Texas, in Alabama. And a lot of physicians practicing there are community physicians. So that's where the site management or site networks come in place. And site networks is a network of physicians or clinical sites where research is being conducted. So CROs select these sites, and these site networks or the physician offices or investigator networks are in charge of conducting the trials, recruiting patients, collecting the blood, sending it in, and following all the protocols as they've designed. So it's a very complex, large-scale system that's developed over time, and used to be more in academics, and now has moved on to the private sector as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's a full production with so many moving parts, right? Like the pharmaceuticals that have the funding and essentially ownership of the drug. The CROs, as you said, it's middlemen, but more than middlemen, I mean, really like trial managers, and they handle the logistics of how patients potentially could get recruited, keeping the data, storing the data, remaining compliant with regulation, HIPAA, and all of that stuff. And helping the physicians actually do it. Because if you're running a really busy practice and you have a high volume of patients, you want to be involved with research and also help your patients potentially be involved with new drug development. I mean, it is almost impossible to do this by yourself. You need something like the CROs that are professionals at doing it. So it's very interesting, this process. And you know what you commented on, that it's shifted away from academics a bit. Obviously, academics still has a lot of clinical trials going on, but the fact that it doesn't only have to be done in that setting, I mean, for one, it could make it a bit more efficient and less red tape, because big institutions in general are slower at things and less efficient at things. But two, it almost coincides with like the funding cuts that we just mentioned from the governmental level coming on down. Those are putting a lot of downwards pressure on these big institutions, these academic institutions, and their funding and ability to get these kinds of grants. You're almost hamstrung in a way, and it may make the private side a much more not only possible avenue to do this, but one that may not require such huge grants and funding from the government level.
Yeah, like for example, we run a big clinical research business, and we have many sites across the United States, right? In Texas, in Dallas, we have sites in Dallas and Houston and South Texas. We have sites in California and in Philadelphia, and a lot of times, these pharmaceuticals or the CROs cannot find site networks like academic institution to be able to activate sites like that all over the country. So for private site networks like ours, they can just come to us and say that, hey, we will have one contract. We can get access to all these different sites and these diverse populations and activate all sites by just talking to one person, because we function as a more efficient organization. So there could be one point of contact that can be a point of contact for all these different sites around the United States, and they cannot do that at academic centers where there's a lot more red tape, a lot more bureaucracy, where you have to get permission from multiple different stakeholders before you can move on. Whereas here, it's easy to make a decision. One person decides, yeah, let's finalize this contract. This is how much we will charge per patient or per study, and let's sign this and get it through, and let's start the trial. So usually the startup times are much faster for private site networks versus academic institutions.
No, that makes sense. I mean, the more lean you are, the easier things are that way. I mean, in terms of speed, but also cost. And that brings up another interesting topic is a bit on the ethics and finance side, right? And there's so many different players in this, like the patient themselves, who is a patient, but also the subject, right? I mean, this is research. They're a subject, a human subject. Obviously, keeping it all as ethical as possible with all of the rules. But the ethics of that, like, are these patients potentially double dipping in multiple different trials? Because some people become professional trial patients. That's how they make their income. They gather funding and money, and that's how they maintain their livelihood. That's one thing to consider, and it's hard to really parse that out. Two is like the incentives now for a doctor or a CRO or anyone involved in this process. The more patients you enroll, potentially, the more the trial is pushed forward towards eventually drug development. You are incentivized in some way to just do more. It becomes a volume game and a bit of an assembly line. And obviously, the pharmaceutical company, at the end of the day, is a business. Their main incentive is to their shareholders. So obviously, they have to go through this process. There's a lot of check marks, like you said, with the trial phases and the FDA and all the regulation. But their whole goal is to get this out to market to recoup their R&D costs and eventually make a profit. So there's a lot of potential checkpoints in this whole journey of drug development where it could be a little ethically swayed financially.
Yeah, there's incentive for patients to be part of clinical trials. Patients get access to free medications, free labs, and also compensation for the time and travel. So there are professional patients, but I'd say majority of the patients go into clinical trials for the right reasons. Most of them, get recommended by their doctors, by their physicians, or a lot of them seek out trials for sometimes medications that are not yet available in the market, and these medications can possibly help them. So a lot of patients seek out clinical trials through websites or through online marketing or social media marketing that they see. So they seek out versus some get recommended by the physicians. But yeah, there's a small component of professional patients that double dip and go to multiple trials, and sometimes there's no way to know if they're in multiple trials at the same time, and you have to take their word, and you don't even know if the medication that is part of the it's at home, are they even truly taking it. So that's where the physician patient relationship comes into play. Being a good investigator, a principal investigator, it's very important for you to judge every patient, see if they would be good candidates for the trial, and honestly, have frank conversations up front. I mean, tell them that yes, this may potentially help you. You may get a placebo. It is a clinical trial, so you could either be in the treatment arm versus the placebo arm. Um, you also have to be frank that yes, you are helping us by being part of this trial. So we provide a lot of more personalized care and service for these patients, because they're doing us a favor. They're doing a favor to science, doing a favor to society. But then we also have to remind them that the medication they're on currently, that's cured their heart failure or prevented their first heart attack, or you know the medications they're currently on, someone participated in clinical trials in the past to help them get there, help them live longer, help them get to 60, 70, 80-year old, and now they can maybe repay the favor as well. So there's multiple conversations you have to have. Physicians do get compensated for their work when they're monitoring a large trial and supervising a large clinical trial like that. You do get compensated for every patient, but there are checks from the pharmaceutical side and from the CRO side. They're the ones paying you, and they want to make sure that they're not paying you for the wrong reasons and for just for your greed. So there's constant monitoring, right? I mean, so you there's trials where they're high enrolling trials. You enroll 5 patients and they put a pause on it. They make sure they come in and they make sure that all the data you've collected is accurate. All the subjects that you've enrolled in the trial truly qualify for the trial, and you are not frauding them in any way, because these again are larger corporations that want to maximize their profits and minimize their revenue, and they want to make sure that they're not paying some sites, some physicians money for no reason, and then them providing them poor quality data, right? So in the end, I mean, this is part of science, right? I mean, you teach patients, we have to do these trials with patient involvement. They have to be part of these clinical trials. Yes, there is a lot of evidence that patients who are in clinical trials get a lot more personalized treatment. They end up doing better because they do get close monitoring. Their labs are checked frequently, right? They have interaction with people in the medical community more often, so they're getting their blood pressure checked, they're getting their labs checked, and they're potentially getting a life-saving medication versus just a placebo, but still having frequent interactions. So there's a lot of benefits. Yes, patients are helping. They are, but also they're also benefiting from this.
No, that's very interesting. And it's also not just like, oh, a bunch of doctors are recruiting patients, they're getting paid for it. I mean, it it adds time. It takes away time from your otherwise the running of your practice, seeing patients that are your other patients, the ones that are not related to the trials, having research staff, research coordinators, all of the special regulation involved with safe data storage, whether it's with the cloud, in person, or whatever, the site visits, extra time to meet with these people, the coordinators and stuff, communication with CROs or the pharmaceutical company themselves. So it's a lot of extra stuff, right? So it's not just, oh man, Dr. X enrolled these 5 patients this week. Let's cut them a check now, one for each patient. I mean, it goes towards a lot of the extra overhead, which is separate from your own practice overhead. It's separate. It's a whole different thing that you're doing. So I think a lot of the initial like naysayers or pessimism about, oh, these doctors are just getting paid to enroll a bunch of patients. I mean, yeah, time has a value, and they're adding a lot more of their time into this in addition to their real clinical resources. So in some ways, it's got to be compensated. It's the same thing when you apply for an NIH grant for research in the lab. I mean, you have carve outs within that grant. The budget is very stringent, and this much is for materials in the lab, reagents, test tubes. This much is for hiring clinical staff, support staff, research staff. This much is for statistics. This much is for manuscript preparation. And then you have carve outs for indirect cost and your own time that you have now 20% of your allotted time is going to be covered by the funding from this grant. I mean, that basically covers some of your salary.
Yeah.
So it's no different whether the grant is from a government institution or you're getting funding from a private entity. It still goes to cover a whole litany of different expenses that are just necessary to do this endeavor.
Yeah, I mean the amount of paperwork and documentation that goes into clinical trials is just unreal. Just because we have such high regulatory requirements in our country with the FDA, there's so many different forms to be filled out, to be kept up with. The protocols constantly keep changing, and an updated protocol needs to be reviewed all the time. The IRB is constantly making corrections, or there's pauses, and the IRB has to review everything constantly. The investigation review board, um, and there's a huge a lot of manpower involved, right? I mean, you have multiple coordinators for clinical trials. I mean, just one coordinator per clinical trial sometimes is not enough. You need to hire people that are making sure the quality is good, right? You have to make sure that the data that being collected by and written down by the coordinator and entered into the computer is accurate, and it makes sense. You're right. You have to make sure that there's people that are chart screening. They're going through patients and making sure that the patient qualifies or does not qualify, and maybe suggesting patients that could qualify, because you have to mine through a lot of data to see what patients could qualify, what patients could not qualify for a clinical trial. And clinical trials is how we've advanced medicine in the country, right? I mean, we would not have these life-saving medications, these life-changing devices, through which now we're doing shoulder replacements and hip replacements and treating heart failure and cholesterol and putting in stents. These had to go through clinical trials. I think it's one of the most important part of medicine, right? The advancing of medicine through clinical research is as important as practice of medicine and treating patients, right? So yeah, patients do get a lot of benefits because, for example, we're doing a lot of clinical trials with the GLP-1 agonists that we've talked about, and some of the patients were able to get on these medications through clinical trials, and they truly seek out these medications because it helps them lose weight, improve their metabolism, and they got the medication for free under supervised care, and they benefited from that. But then we also benefited because now we're able to bring on these life-saving medications into the market, and then have larger populations benefit from it too.
So here's another question. What happens to these patients? Let's say you have a patient that goes through a clinical trial for, like you're mentioning, like a GLP-1, like Ozempic or something. They go through it, they get a benefit from it, they lose weight, their glucose gets better controlled, they become overall healthier. The trial ends, the drug goes to market. What happens to that patient? Do they keep getting that medication at obviously like a subsidized or free cost, or now they go kind of back to being just like any other patient? And okay, now it's time for you to pay for your med, or you and your insurance combined pay for your med, just like everybody else. What is that interplay
It's very
like?
dependent on the trial. I mean, some trials have an open label phase where they tell you, okay, after 3 years, once the medication is approved or the trial ends, we'll enter the open label phase where you'll be able to know if you were on placebo or or sorry, you won't know if you're on placebo or not, but everyone will get the actual investigational product. So some trials have that, some trials do not have that, and that's where the physician that's working with the patient has to make a plan of transitioning them on to another medication or the same medication that's now approved by the FDA. It's on the market. um, so yeah, sometimes it ends and patients don't have a plan or are now off that medication. um, but and sometimes there are extension studies where patients enter, and then those studies are looking for long-term effects of these medications. So they enter those trials, they get offered those trials first, and they enter those, and they can continue being on that medication for a longer time. So there's very different things. It's all study specific, and especially also um, depending on what was being looked at in the study. Was it a cardiovascular outcomes trial? Or was it just a short-term trial seeing if this medication within 12 months lowers the cholesterol by this percentage, and that was it, so very dependent on the trial, but you have to have a plan with your physician, and that's why a lot of these trials need to be done with physician supervision, and trial physicians play a very important role in advancing medicine pretty much.
Oh, totally. I mean, clinical research is huge. What's interesting is like this is all drug development. Like within orthopedics, a lot of the clinical trials are really like surgical outcomes or the outcomes of non-surgical treatment, right? A lot of that is weighing between for X condition, Y condition, do I do surgery or not do surgery? And what happens to the patient? If I have someone that comes in with an elbow fracture, what happens if I just treat it with a splint, and then they do some therapy and give it some time and see, versus I fix it. I go in there, I open it up, put plates and screws, and then see. There's not really like a drug there. You're not really comparing something like that, and I guess non-op treatment is not really a placebo. It's just you kind of live life. That a lot of that is different because it's much less like private industry involvement. Obviously, with implants, you can have industry-funded studies. That happens a lot, but a lot of the studies within orthopedics in something like this are a lot of retrospective looking at chart data of a large series of patients that underwent some similar treatment and how they did versus a actual randomized trial where you said, okay, I'm going to fix this fracture with the standard plate and screw type fixation for the broken bones versus I'll do a joint replacement on it. You basically cut out the fracture, do a replacement so they don't have to worry about the broken bones and see which arm did better. Those are very common in orthopedics, but the difference being essentially all of those are surgeon led. there's really no intermediary like we have talked about with drug development, that it's a pharmaceutical company, CROs, and then doctors and their patients kind of coalescing together and making this happen. With a lot of these trials and these case series, these retrospective reviews, and even prospective trials in orthopedics, it's kind of just the surgeons just do it along with
Yeah.
their patients, and like really like an army of residents and fellows who work together to make the research happen. And a lot of them are not funded. They're just done based off of the time and sheer will to push science forward, because there is no funding coming from anywhere for a lot of these trials.
Yeah, definitely. I
It's
mean
a
that,
different
and
game. It's a different
it's a
game.
different game. And how do you do a placebo trial in the surgical field, right? It's tough. You can't really do
Yeah,
surgery
I
on
mean,
someone and not
it's funny.
implant
Like
anything.
it, like one of the most like landmark orthopedic studies, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like the most reputable journal in all of medicine. So for an orthopedic trial to be published in there is almost unheard of. I mean, you would think that someone played an April Fool's joke, like the New England Journal of Medicine publishing an orthopedic trial, but it was actually done at Baylor many, many years ago, as looking at knee scopes, knee arthroscopy, and basically seeing like, could you do just like a little sham procedure in a knee that had arthritis, just going in. Patient didn't know whether they had something done to their meniscus in the knee, the little shock absorbing cartilage disc in the knee, or not. And so they did a sham. They just basically, the patient sleep, made little arthroscopic portals. And in some of the patients, they just stitched it up. And the patient was like, well, I got the scars. I don't know if I had surgery or not. Or they just kind
Yeah.
of faked it. Versus the other group that went in and did the scope. They did a little shaving, debriding for the torn meniscus and the arthritic knee. And they really found that basically, like, there's really no difference. That the sham
Really?
procedure, sham, I'm calling it, basically did just as well, because the knee is already arthritic, and just doing a little bit of a so-called cleanup job on the knee doesn't really do anything once it's arthritic. The die is cast, it's done for. It's kind of like if you have brake pads on your car, they start wearing away. It doesn't matter what kind of fancy lubricant you put on there. You have lost material. You have lost a brake pad. You just need a new brake pad. And I think that study, it was published in the New England Journal because it was just so well done. It
Wow.
would be really hard to put a patient in the modern day under general anesthesia, make a fake cut on them, and they wake up not knowing if they had a surgery done or not. But um, that's like the so-called placebo type research in orthopedics.
Yeah, that's wild.
Harder to do now.
Yeah, I mean, it's things are changing. The landscape is changing quite a bit, and within drug development now, it's a data game, right? You're constantly collecting data, and you're constantly looking for patients. Sometimes, as a physician, who is a cardiologist, I'm seeing a lot of patients that are not on clinical trials and seeing them on a daily basis, and then seeing patients who are interested in clinical trials, or who you know you have to have a conversation. You have to take that time out and have discussion with them, and you truly have to talk about placebo, about blinding, and why it is important to not see your own labs. There's a lot of due diligence you need to do, or maybe even discussing with their primary care doctors. Hey, make sure you don't check their lipids, because we're blinding them from their lipids because they're on this medications for the next 12 months.
But that's interesting. Yeah, you got to make sure like other doctors don't don't spill the beans, so to speak.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, these trials are not perfect. Patients do get unblinded, right? They do find out if their lipoprotein A is reduced once they've been on this medication, or they take a GLP-1, and if they're on placebo, they're not losing weight, and if they're not on the placebo, they start losing weight. So that's definitely not blinded clinical trial. It's none of the trials are the perfect. A lot of times the problem with data is that the data can be manipulated, right? You can have a certain amount of patients, and maybe have a smaller experiment, smaller trial, where some data ends up being significant versus, or non-significant, versus if you did the same trial in a lot more population, or a lot larger population, maybe it would be significant. So trial design plays a huge role in the beginning, and now
Yeah,
with
it's got to be appropriately powered.
yeah, it has to be appropriately powered, and now with the advent of AI, now I think things are becoming a lot more efficient. I mean, based on predictive studies and large data models, they're able to predict better. Oh, where to go for these patients, where to look for patients, how many patients should be enrolled in this clinical trial, and even from the site network side or from a physician side, um, AI can play a huge role in data mining and collecting information, suggesting patients that would be eligible for clinical trials. Because that's the hardest part of the game. I mean, you don't want to sound like a salesman where you're trying to sell different clinical trials to the patients, but it's also important to recruit good eligible patients for a clinical trial because you know that can in the end advanced medicine. And where is that balance of not sounding like a salesman and then actually recruiting good patients for the clinical trials? And that's where it can be, a lot of the AI softwares or data mining capabilities can be used to suggest to you good eligible patients that you can then have a conversation with. So there's already a lot of different companies that are working on this where they can have like different plugins to the EMR where as you're seeing the patients, you start getting suggested patients that could be eligible for the multiple clinical trials you're doing. And then, you can, based on those suggestions, have that true, honest discussion with the patient. Hey, I think you'll be a good candidate for this clinical trials. You have all the different eligibility requirements. This is how you will benefit. This is how we will benefit, and these are the services we will provide you while you're on the clinical trial. And if you participate, you're truly helping us advance clinical medicine. And then after having that conversation, hopefully you hope that the patient would agree. If they don't agree, you still treat them the same way. You still make sure you continue treating them. But I think AI will play a huge role in conducting these clinical trials.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's very interesting. I'm using it as a tool to identify patients because it can comb over more data instantly than any human eyes can. Another interesting thing, one of my buddies, he works for a company out of Dallas, actually, that they also use AI for the clinical trial space, but on the other side of it, actually looking at potential targets for drug development. They basically use these giant institutional databases like that the huge cancer centers have, for example. I mean, they're taking biopsies of every tumor. They have DNA and genomics on every single tumor that is resected at that location. I mean, they have huge, remarkable repositories of these DNA libraries. And basically just combing through that data and identifying potential areas that you could target a new chemotherapy drug, a new immunomodulating drug, a new biologic target. All these kind of things. I mean, that's something that there's no human, there's no army of humans that can look through that data and make sense of it. But these AI algorithms, I mean, they are nothing but pattern recognition to the best possible degree. And that's what they're using. And a lot of these companies are now using that as their initial baseline of how to identify a target for drug development and then take that into this whole process we've just talked about. Start going through the phases of the trials, identify patients to, test it on your study cohort and go on. It's very remarkable where this AI stuff can take us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about that. I mean, I think we're gonna have a lot more progress into a lot of these rare diseases, a lot of these rare type of cancers, where a lot of gene therapies where we have not been able to kind of make progress. Right, these rare diseases, only very few patients have them. It's very hard to recruit patients. Um, and sometimes maybe the financial incentives are not there, but with these AI pattern recognitions, with all already present data that we have, we can really develop therapies for a lot of these rare diseases, and a lot of people can go through life-changing treatments. And kind of that's where the other place where AI is also playing a huge role, and technology is playing a huge role, is decentralized clinical trials. So instead of being monitored in the physician's office, now with the use of like different wearables or different tablets, patients can be at their home, have nurse visits, collect data there, have blood draws at their homes, and the clinical trials are decentralized. You don't have to wait for the patient to come into your office. The clinical trials and the data collection can go to their where they are, and make things easier for them, because a lot of patients that participate in the clinical trials may not have time to leave their jobs and come for trial visits. They might not have the transportation to come to the research sites, but if the research capabilities can go to them through a lot of technology, wearables, tablets, you know, video chats and things like that. You know, we can solve a big problem in patient recruitment in clinical trials.
But yeah, it would increase access a ton
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, you increase access. So I mean, you know, and then like clinical trials are very messy. Clinical trials are not always perfect. You know, there's a lot of good patients that are part of it, but then there's a lot of professional patients, like we talked about, right? There's a lot of downfalls in collection of the data. You know, there's good sites where where physicians are truly working on collecting good data, working with integrity, but then there's sites that are not working with integrity. They're focused on maximizing the profits. They are working through their greed and trying to maximize the amount of money they're making from the clinical trials, right? And that messes up the data. Sometimes sites can uh, enroll patients or randomize patients that truly did not need to be randomized, and there's a lot of patients end up being lost to follow-ups. They can recruit. There's stories of people recruiting homeless patients to come in and be part of clinical trials, and then after that, lost to follow-up. You know, so those are bad clinical trials. So clinical trials are messy. They're expensive, but I think they're a necessity in advancement of medicine and advancement of our world pretty much because we need to keep finding new therapies and improve clinical outcomes.
For sure, man. I mean, it's how it's going to push forward. I mean, both of us, every single person listening to this, we've all taken medications that have come about through this whole process. So it's already affected all of our lives. It's only going to continue to.
Yeah,
Interesting stuff, man.
yeah. I hope we keep our government continues to keep funding the right things, and a lot of government support is needed for these trials. So I hope the politicians come to their senses to stop thinking selfishly. Instead of focusing on accumulating their own wealth through these unnecessary wars, they focus on advancing of humanity and focus on science and advancing science.
Totally. Real science and needs funding.
Well,
All
see you
right,
next
guys. Two docs, one mic. We'll see you next time.